Hello and welcome back to myjewelrybench.com. Thanks for tuning in. I've got another watch from a YouTube viewer who sent me his 18 size Elgin 7 jewel for service. This is a pretty nice watch. It is running, but running very erratically, and it only runs for a couple of hours. Actually, I think I got it to run for a total of 6 hours for me, and then it would stop. I did find a few things in here that just needed to be serviced, and we're going to go through that today. So let's get started. Okay guys, before I get started with the repair of the watch, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about those who follow my jewelry designs and 3D modeling for 3D printing. I've created a new website for Blender Gems, and it is blendergems.com. So if you're looking for 3D models, you can get some here for free, as well as small fees for others. For instance, I've got some school ring collection that's part of Blender Gems, but if you only want the school ring selection, you can get that for $20. There are some models here for free, and I'll be adding to this every week. And if you're looking for any other information, I'm also starting an FAQ for Blender on little tips and 5-minute tricks that you can use to help yourself. So check that out when you have a chance. Okay, so now that I bored you with a shameless plug, let's get back into this watch. The Elgin Watch Company, which actually wasn't really the Elgin Watch Company, it was actually part of Elgin, were watches that were distributed under the Atlas line that were lower price pointed watches geared towards everybody or the common man. These were typically 18 size watches. There were a few odds and ends that showed up in like 16 size and 12 size, but you're not going to see many of those. Most of them were 18 size, and most of the ones I've seen are 7 jewel. I've never seen or I've had to work on a 15 jewel Atlas watch, although I've seen some Atlas dials on some Elgin watches. So you might find that occasionally because the parts are completely interchangeable. The Atlas watch is actually one of the lower end of the 18 size Elgin movements, and all the parts are pretty much interchangeable with that series of watch from Elgin. So just keep that in mind. There are very few differences here, and as you can see, this pretty much uses the same parts that you'll find in any typical average 18 size stem wind stem set watch from Elgin. The gears here are pretty good. I was happy to see that for the most part everything really was in good order. There was a lot of dirt here, so that the watch probably would have just run if you probably could have kept winding it and got it to run, but there was some debris in here and dirt and some not that much corrosion. I didn't find any of that, but the spring was in pretty rough shape. If we take a look at the mainspring here, it's gummed up. It looks like this is probably a spring from the 1930s or 40s, and it's in really rough shape. I did try to resurface it because it does have a lot of tensile strength, but polishing this up just didn't give it much go anyway, so I ended up putting a new mainspring in it. I decided to, because the watch would run good in the upright position, but face down it would run poorly, I decided to take out the jewels, and you can see here I'm just going to pull those out by releasing the balance wheel from the balance cock, and then we're going to remove those 2 screws there and start working on the jewels. Both the upper and lower jewels here, there's a hole and a cap jewel on each set, were pretty dirty. They were pretty gummy and dried up oil and debris inside. So it was worth cleaning those up, and it made the watch run a whole lot better. Now, commonly with 18 size 7 jewel watches, and pretty much the Waltham and Hamden and Elgin brands, you'll find that after about 100 years of running or neglect, you might find that these watches just never really keep perfect time. And that's because over time the pinions kind of oval out the holes and the plates, and we run into a little bit of slop or play in the movement. Now, while that in most cases can be rectified, probably it's never going to be perfect. And I've had decent luck with most of them, but trying to fix some thin brass plates can sometimes be a little bit daunting, and you can actually cause more problems than not. So here you can see I'm just putting the jewels back in. This is the lower set of jewels, and we'll get those tied in. Everything's pretty much been cleaned and dried, and we're just going to get these jewels back in place, and we're going to do a test on the balance wheel. Again, if you do find yourself getting some Atlas watches here and there, just remember that their interchangeable parts are with Elgin's 7 jewel movements. So parts are readily available for this Atlas line. And once you're happy with the lower set, we can start getting the upper set all screwed back down. And the jewels are in place. We'll just put the 2 little screws to hold those in and tighten them up. Now, if you're going to work on these yourself, just be careful. These screws can really damage the balance cock, so you don't want to over tighten them. Once they want to stop, just stop. Don't try to force it anymore. And if it stops and the head's kind of protruding from the balance cock, then just check it for debris. I've seen a lot of watches come to me for repair where, I'm thinking that maybe it's got a cracked jewel because of the way it's acting, and when I open it up, I'll find a stripped screw. And because the screw has been stripped out, the cap jewel will kind of loosen up a little bit, and that can cause some issues. And that can be fixed. A quick fix, you could put a little drop of Loctite on that and then dry it up. Use very, very little. Have some respect for the next guy who's got to get in there and fix it. Or you could retap those. Here you can see I'm putting the balance wheel back onto the cock, and we'll put the collet there. We'll tighten that up and make sure that the balance or the hairspring is in the adjustment fork. And tighten up that screw that holds the collet in place. Now, the first time you do this, if you've never done this before, this can be very daunting and scary. And if you're not careful, you can break that hairspring or bend it. So be careful when handling that part. And here's the new mainspring. We've got to get that into the barrel, so we're going to put that in now before we start assembly. I like to have everything ready to go before I start assembling the watch. Some people handle it a little bit differently or have a different order, but I like to make sure that all the little parts are all ready to go when getting it ready for assembly. So now I've got the balance or the mainspring in. We'll get the pinion in place, and once that's in place, I can go ahead and oil it and make sure that it's ready to go. I've actually pre-oiled this spring, which I like to do myself as I'm winding it into the watch winder. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm assembling a watch, before I go through a complete assembly, and especially after I've cleaned the cap and hole jewels for the balance, I like to do a test. After I've assembled the balance assembly, I'll screw it onto the plate, make sure the upper and lower jewels are clean by doing a full test. And with no escapement in place, the balance wheel should just continuously turn and run down very, very slowly. And of course, I'll check this in the upright and face down position as well as in a side position so that I can see if there's any friction on the movement. And here you can see the balance wheel is moving pretty good. I apologize for the shaking. It's kind of hard for me to hold this part in front of the camera and get a flashlight to shine on it. Once I've done that, I'll take it apart and I'll make any adjustments I have to make. Luckily, with Jeremy's watch, I didn't have to make too many adjustments here. I just wanted to make sure that that was free and clear, and the balance jewels were clean. So now we'll start the assembly process, and I'm going to assemble the clutch assembly or the setting assembly first. And to do that, I like to put a little oil in places where I know when I put those gears in that the oil will kind of hold those gears in place if I have to kind of tip this on its side or if I accidentally flip it over. You don't need a lot of oil to do that, and you're going to lube these places anyway. Now, along with this particular gear, you'll notice there's a little click below it, and that click is actually on the pivot arm for the setting system. So we'll just take each gear, we'll put it in place. And there is one gear here that you're going to see is kind of a little tough one because there's a spring under it, so you're going to have to be conscious of it. Here you can see this is the swing arm for the setting, and I'm going to put a little oil here just to hold that gear onto the frame so that when I flip this over, the gear is not going to come off. It's kind of held in place with that liquid. And also, when you're taking these apart, pay attention to what you're doing, and that way it'll help you with reassembly Pretty much all watches are similar. There's a few differences here and there from this era, and it doesn't matter from what manufacturer. There aren't that many just differences in manufacturing. And this is that little gear I was talking about, that little spring there, which applies upward pressure on that gear, will sometimes become a nightmare to get seated correctly. Now you just have to pay attention to these screws. Sometimes they're reverse thread, sometimes they're standard thread, so make sure that you, if you're unscrewing something and it's not working well, try the opposite direction. For instance, this is a reverse threaded screw, and you want to be careful because you don't want to break that screw and cause damage to it. If you break that off, you might have a hard time finding that part or removing the screw from the thread. So once I've got the clutch and settings system in there, I'll just finish up by putting the last piece on. This is a little cover for that pop-up or sprung gear. And again, we have to just make sure it's in the right place. It's a little tough to work with that sometimes. I don't know why I was having a hard time working with this one. I've done this a million times, but every once in a while, depends on what time of night it is, I have an issue trying to get that little gear back in place. Now with everything seated, I'm just going to make sure all the screws are tight and do a test. And I just want to make sure that the gears turn and everything turns freely. Pretty happy with that. And I know some of you guys are going to complain that it looks like I'm manhandling this and beating it, but I'm not applying any pressure to these gears. They move pretty freely, and I've already polished all the gears and taken any burrs off. Now for the train assembly, put the center wheel in second, the third wheel goes in, or the second wheel goes in first, then of course the third wheel or the second hand wheel, and the escapement wheel goes in last. So the last part of assembly is to get the pallet fork in place, and I get that upper pinion stuck in the bearing, and once it's in the bearing correctly, I like to use a little bit of Rotico. Rotico, I can poke in the little hole where the balance wheel goes in, and it'll kind of hold the pallet fork in place while I'm assembling the watch, because that's the one piece I can't put into the main plate when I'm assembling this watch. I mean, you could, but it's kind of tricky. This is an easier way of doing it, and assembling these full plate watches can be tricky. So now that I've got both halves sandwiched together, the gears are in the middle. I'm holding this very, very carefully and very gently because I don't want to damage any of the pinions in the gears. And what we're going to do is use a fine pair of tweezers and start aligning the pinions on each of the gears into the correct bearing point. So you're going to do this a little bit at a time, one gear at a time, and it'll fall into place and seat. And once it does, you can start screwing both plates back together. And I usually start with one screw, the center screw for the plate to hold it in. And here you can see pretty much everything's aligned. I apologize for the focus. Seems like I'm getting my hands more than the watch. There we go. So every one of the pinions is in its appropriate bearing and or jewels. So of course this watch doesn't have jewels there. We're just going to deal with that later. So now I'm going to put that one screw into the watch frame. That's the center screw for the lower plate, and I'll move on to the second and third screws. And once that's done, I know the train system is complete, and then I'll just give it a quick test. Now here you can see one of the case screws protruding from the plate. I couldn't get that out for some reason. It was a replacement part, probably from a different watch, and it just wouldn't come out, and I didn't want to do any damage. Now it's time to assemble the setting and clutch system. So this is the clutch part of the clutch system, and this pushes the actuator arm to move it into winding and setting modes. I'm going to oil that as I go along, bit by bit. This piece has to go in before we can put the mainspring barrel in. This is the winding gear for the mainspring. Yes, I know there's a little bit of fuzz in there. I did go ahead and remove that, but I missed it during filming. I saw it later when I was working on this. Now the barrel's in place. I've got the cover for the barrel on, and we're going to screw that down. There's almost always 2 screws in a full plate watch barrel cover, but sometimes you'll find some watches have 3. So just keep that in mind. It's rare, but most of the time it's just 2. Now that that cover is in place and screwed down tight, I'm going to go ahead and start oiling the train on both the upper and lower sides of the plates. Just a little drop. You don't need a lot of oil. I see a lot of people over oil watches thinking it's going to run better, but it doesn't. Typically what happens if you have a dirty watch and you over oil it, you're just spreading the dirt around and it'll actually make things a little worse over time. And if you look closely, you might see a little ovaling on some of those bearings. I tried to tighten one of them up a little bit, but I didn't want to work too hard because the brass was kind of thin under that plating. Now in this case, I'm just going to oil the lower and upper jewels for the balance staff. I'm going to give this a quick wind. Just wind it a couple times, and I want to test the pallet fork and make sure that there's no problems with the pallet fork running with the escapement. And again, I'll seat the balance, the complete balance, and we're going to line that up. Once it's correctly aligned, I just want to make sure that it's not overbanked. And of course, it's a little tight right now because of the way it's situated, but it starts to run on its own. And we'll put the screw onto the balance cock to hold that onto the plate. Now, once you tighten this screw down, you will be aligning the balance cock a little bit better, which should give you a lot less friction on the balance staff in the upper and lower jewels. Now it's about this time I like just to double check everything, make sure the train's working good, and we've got a good spin on the balance staff and balance wheel, and looks like we're working pretty good here. That new mainspring really helps, and of course having clean balance jewels really makes a big difference. Now before I go doing anything else, what I want to do is assemble the dial side of the main plate. So first thing I'll do is we'll finish up the upper side of the watch by adding the cannon pinion. Remember, the cannon pinion is what holds the minute hand. So we've got the setting gear there, and I'm just making sure they're all seated correctly. Now we'll put the hour wheel on, and once that's made to fit, we'll just work our way up to, I think I needed a dial washer for this, I don't remember. Maybe, maybe not. I think I added a dial washer to this later just to make sure that the hour hand didn't slip, although the minute hand will hold it down in place without any friction. So here you can see I'm seating the dial. There are 3 screws holding the dial in, just like any typical 18 size Elgin watch of this era. And we'll tighten those dial screws in so that they contact the dial feet on the back of the dial. You remember, you don't want to screw those in too tight because you could strip them easy or break a dial foot. And now this is a good time to look through magnification and just check the train and make sure that everything is running perfectly. You should see a nice click, or hear a nice click, and you should see a good beat. And the next step from here, I'm going to go on and recase this. Actually, the next step for me was to time the watch and just make sure it was timed good. Now here I'm showing you how to recase the watch. This is a clamshell case, so it is a hinged holder ring that holds the watch in place. You're going to put the movement in that ring. It swings into the case, or what's more commonly called a swing out case. We're going to tighten our case screws down onto that frame. And you have to be careful here. You make sure that you're aligned completely correctly with the stem of the watch so that it goes back into place. Now I'm just going to test it for winding and setting. I believe Jeremy's watch had a really good stem lock, and it was a little tough to pull out to set the time, but it works good and it has very little wear on it. I'll just use a little bit of Rotico, make sure I don't have any debris on the hands, And I'm just going to check the hand here, just make sure that it doesn't rub or that the wheel is out of alignment. Now we'll set the hour hand. Once the hour hand's in position, I'm going to go into setting mode. I'm going to set this for 3 or 9 o'clock, which are the typical times that I use. Then I'll align the minute hand. Once it's aligned correctly, I can push that down into place onto the cannon pinion. This is also the best time to check and make sure that the hands are not going to make contact, which would stop the watch. So we want to see free position for all 3 hands. They should be at good levels, good distant levels. So each hand should be at least a 0.5 millimeter away from the other. On some older watches, you may find, over time, these watches might have a little damage somewhere here and there, and it'll cause a poor alignment with some of the gears, which cause the hands to go up and down depending on what point on the clock face they're pointing to. Once that's done, I'll screw the watch together and we'll just double check it for timing and make sure that it's still running good. There's the watch assembled. Gonna wipe off my hand prints from the with a polishing cloth. This watch was in pretty good shape when I got it. It didn't need a lot of work, which was nice. It needed a service and a mainspring. I think that those 2 things help make this watch what it is. A really good everyday wearing watch. Jeremy, I hope you like your watch. You should have it back by now. I've been behind for a couple of weeks. I had some computer problems and other issues, so now that I'm back, I wanted to get this video up and online as soon as possible. Well, gang, thanks for watching the video. This week we fixed Jeremy's pocket watch, and I want to say if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you know anyone who would be interested in this stuff, share it on your social media channel. Every little bit goes to help my channel grow, and I appreciate it. Because of you, I'm growing pretty good on YouTube, so I really appreciate all your views. If you want to learn anything more, you can go to the website, www.myjewelrybunch.com. And if you're looking for 3D models that are related to jewelry and other things, check out Blender Gems as that site grows. I'll be expanding it. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day.